Okay guys, I'm going to start this watercolor practice painting from the beginning. I've traced it. There's the original. Tracing is totally fine. Just to note, I wouldn't really trace it this dark if I wanted to make this, like for real, because you can't really hide these pencil lines once you start painting. And it's, you don't really want it to be outlined in pencil. But I'm doing this for an example, so I made it darker. All right, so we need to start background first, which means we do this background sky. And I need some really watered down blue paint, so lots of water, and I think a little bit of purple would be good in there too. Well, that's a lot of purple. So you want a lot of water and a lot of paint to start this thing with, because you want this paint to be really watery and weak, just to fill in the background. Just a touch of red to that. And if you're like, ooh, that's just a little stronger, just add water to it on the paper. That'll thin it out on the paper. So getting paint over the stem is no big deal because it's going to be dark, but I really don't want to get paint on this pear. So I'm going to try to trace the pear carefully with my brush. If I get a little bit on there, it's really not a big deal. And I'm going to try to trace this line carefully down here too. So at this point, a bigger brush, if you had one, would be really handy, something like this, that you could just use to quickly spread out a lot of paint. It would save you some time on something like this, but usually you don't have a brush like this, so you can use any kind of watercolor brush. Just the bigger the brush, the more time you're going to save. But you'll definitely want something a little smaller to get these areas. This is a great time to just practice your brush technique and your brush stroke to see how closely you can follow that edge. If you're getting scratchy, dry looking paint, it's because you're not using enough water. You really need to use a lot of water when you do this to get that soaked in. Now, anywhere where it's a little too like a little too much color, you can use a paper towel, soak some of that extra color up. Because I want it to have sort of a cloudy look. This almost looks like sky for some reason in the background. So this is a nice just background that helps bring the best out on the colors of the pear because it's complementary to the pear, blue and orange. All right, I'm switch to my smaller brush now. I'm going to grab some blue, and I don't need this paint to be as watered down, so I'm going to start with some stronger paint here, and I'm going to get this blue stuff more around the edge of the pear. So I'm going to start about here, and I'm just going to follow this edge, lay down some blue. And I want it to get a little bit lighter, so I'm going to add a little bit of water to that paint now. And with that more watered down paint, I'm going to carry it on up here. I can even go back and add a little bit more water to thin that out even more. Back to some strong blue along this edge too. And some water to kind of blend that in. Okay, that's looking pretty good. Pretty happy with that. If it's got some puddles somewhere and you're like, ooh, I don't really want that puddle there, dry your brush, get the water out of it, then use your brush, dry your brush to soak up some of that paint. It'll just pull it up, be soaked up anywhere where it's like, it's just a little too dark. Dry brush will soak it up. And then the paint around it will come blended out, and it should be more or less smooth when you get done. You can kind of blend it a little bit with your brush. With watercolor paint, guys, when you get the paper really wet like this, if you just keep brushing back and forth, you're going to end up kind of like destroying your paper. You'll start to see it like kind of, the paper is kind of like falling apart. That's not a good sign. You're over brushing. Okay. Moving on now, we're going to do the table next. And with the table, I need like a purplish, dirty purple color. So lots and lots of water again, a little bit of blue paint, a little bit of red paint, and a little bit of brown paint. But I need a lot of water. I don't want to run out of this halfway through, so water's free. Just get as much of it as you need. And there. Again, the big brush will make this a lot faster if you happen to have a big handy brush. Put that stuff on really quickly. And it's totally okay to go around. It's totally okay to go around over that shadow because the shadow is going to be the table. What I got to watch out for, I got to be really careful here. I don't want to get any paint to blend with this because otherwise we're not going to have a separation between our table. So now I'm going to get my brush and smaller brush and kind of go back around the edges a little bit. I probably would be okay if I got a little bit of paint on the pear here, but I'm trying not to. And I want to make sure I leave some white space between that table, top of the table, and that blue, because if those mix together, when they're wet, it's just going to fall apart. That's looking pretty good. Okay, anytime, again, you got some puddles and you're like, oh, that's just too dark, dry your brush, use your brush to soak up some of that extra paint so it doesn't dry as dark there. Looking good. Okay, pretty happy with this right now. Okay, before I move on, I need to make sure this is dry-ish. It doesn't have to be 100% dry, but if I have, like, say, a puddle of water right here and I start painting this pear, it's just going to go blah out into that. That's not good. So, paper towel, maybe make sure that this area is dry. Because I don't want to do this again. Painted this pear about 400 times now. Okay, so switching to my smaller brush, and I'm going to mix up some kind of yellowish orange colors because I'm going to start with my lighter values. So I'm going to yellow, mostly yellow, maybe just a little tiny bit of orange in there. And it can be, the paint can be a little bit dirty, and it's not going to matter. It doesn't have to be like ultra bright sunshine yellow. And I want to start putting in some of these lighter yellowish oranges first. So there's some here, kind of does something like that. And I'm trying to follow the contour. Definitely trying to follow the contour. Some in here. So brush strokes, try to keep them following the contour of the shape. I need this to be wet for this to work. Okay, my next step, I'm going to add a little bit of orange to that. So grab some orange, add it to that color. And I'm going to put in some of the darker, a little bit of the darker oranges now. They're not even really dark oranges yet, to be honest with you. It's still just some oranges. Oh man, this is what I love about watercolor painting. It just does its thing. Everybody's is going to be different. There's no two that are going to be alike. So as you start putting the orange in, it just goes where it needs to go. The water just moves it. If you're starting to get any puddles and you're like, some of these puddles are going to be good. They're going to create like these spots, these darker spots. But you don't want it to be just totally soaked. So I might pick up a little bit of extra of this and then that'll smooth back out as it dries. The water will kind of replace it and smooth it out. Now, orange paint. I'm going to put some strong orange paint on here, so I'm not adding a lot of water. I'm stirring the orange paint good to build up some thicker, stronger paint. And now I'm going to paint this edge, but there's a little place right here. I want to leave that. I like that little light area right there, so I'm going to try to leave that. So I'm going to paint around, and about here I'm going to pull back and then come back in. And practice your brush technique. You should be trying to do this in smooth strokes. There's a great spot. Anywhere wet on wet, it just kind of naturally just sort of blends out. And if it's not, go back over it, add more water, more paint. It's wet on wet right now, so it should just sort of be naturally blending out. Okay, that's starting to look pretty good. Now I need to start getting these red values. It's still pretty wet though, so before I go to the red, I'm going to dry my brush again a little bit, and I'm going to soak up a little bit of this extra water and a little bit of this extra paint. Don't want it to be soaking wet when I put the reds on, because I don't want them to just start running all over the place. I want to have a little bit more control over them. This also is a great technique to kind of build up some like lighter spotted areas on the pear. Nature has a lot of randomness to it, a lot of random patterns. They're not that predictable. Okay, strong red paint, and we want this to mix with the orange. And you can just kind of let your brush strokes kind of wander a little bit here, you know, just kind of let them kind of play around to get some of these spots. You don't really have to try to make the exact same orange, you know, you're just trying to make something similar, so don't think it has to be identical. Yeah, I'm liking that. That's looking good. Okay, now, there's a few places where I want to just kind of maybe drop a little red, drop a little red, drop a little red, and then without soaking it, just a damp brush, just add a little drop of water to that, and then let that red kind of just spread out and kind of play around there, kind of do something and see what happens. Now I need some really watery paint because I don't want to leave quite so much white here, but I don't want soaking wet paint. So before I start, I might tap the brush a little bit, get some of that out, and I just want to put in some watered down paint through here. Okay. And remember, you can grab paint off of this and paint it somewhere else. I don't want to do this yet because I want to keep that line there, and to keep that line, that means I have to let this dry. So painting with a dry brush is actually going to remove paint and leave more white. So if you want to make something darker, that means you have to go get more paint and add to it. If you just brush without picking up more paint, then you're just taking it away. Okay, I think we're ready for the stem. We're getting pretty close to being done. This is not a hard project. Getting some water, getting some brown. I want some pretty strong, thick paint. You could even add a little purple to this, just kind of darken it a little bit. Black is scary. You don't want to add a lot of black to your paint because it will overwhelm things really fast. All right, so little tip here, if you're trying to get more detail, spin the brush when you pick it up, and you want to make sure this area is really, really, really dry. I don't want any brown to kind of get into that blue. So touch it, make sure it's dry, and then this is where you just got to be really, really careful. Try to keep your edges as neat as possible. smaller brush would be good here, but I'm just using what I have in my hands. And I want to let this brown kind of blend in with this red right here. So I'm just going to let them kind of mix together. There we go. Now, I want to create these little highlights along parts of this. So what I'm going to do, clean my brush, dry it, and I'm going to paint in the highlights with a dry brush. It will soak the paint up. I may have to do that a couple times. Clean the brush, soak some more paint up. And if I want to add shadows, I can grab some darker paint and drop it in where I want it to be darker. Okay. Still letting this area dry a little bit before I do anything else with it, but I could, since I just used the brown, I could take some of this brown paint and get some of these brown spots in there, but I need to water it down just a little bit. I don't want it to overwhelm. So there's a lot of purple there, but there's some brown too, and water down this brown just a little bit, and I want to get some of these spots. So this has got a little bit of a brown spot. This has got a little bit of a brown spot here. And while this is still wet, the paint will kind of do its thing and mix with it. All through here, I want to put some of this brown to darken this. Okay. Anywhere where you think, oh, that's just too much paint, that's just too much of a puddle, dry your brush, soak it up so you don't get as much there. Okay, I think we're ready for the shadow now. So to get this shadow, we want to, looks like we're going to use a lot of reds and blues, and blue over here, red here. This is a really interesting shadow. It's very playful. There's, you know, it's not a lot of structure to it. So I'm going to grab some red paint and maybe just a little bit of blue I got laying around here and add it to that. Something about like that looks pretty good for this color. Yep, very good. And I don't want this shadow, it's not going to make a ton of difference because this is supposed to be pretty dark, but I don't want this shadow just to totally blend in with that. So I'm going to start over here, try to paint this shadow in. But I'm not quite going to paint it right up to the edge yet. Try to be careful not to mix these two. Now, while this is still wet, I might grab some strong red paint, add it to there. I might get me some strong blue paint, kind of add it over here, and just let this paint mix in to the shadow. A little bit of water, help kind of blend that in. Water moves paint. and it lightens it. Okay. Got just a few little finishing touches I want to do. That's really, really wet right there, so if I move this thing, I might have a mess. So before I do anything else, I'm going to use a dry brush. I'm going to soak a little bit of this extra paint up right here. Oh man, that's such a cool special effect, the way those two colors mix together. Now, I still want to add a little bit of watered down yellow right there. So I got some yellow, kind of water it down a little bit, maybe add a little bit of orange to it. This should be, yep, that's dry enough now where these should stay separated. And I want to get this little spot right here. Now that that's dry, that stays separated. And anywhere else where I'm like, I don't really want white right there, you know, I want a little bit more color. If these are dry, you can add a little bit more color to these spots so that they don't quite stand out if they're just a little too light. Anywhere you want. Maybe just a little bit right through here. I want to keep some white over here, though. I don't want to overdo this. So there we go. And at this point, the painting's pretty much finished. I mean, if there's little touches, little finishing touches, little things you can try to clean up, you can do that. And I need to do one more thing really to the shadow, and that's just grab some black to get the darkest values of the shadow on there. This dark shadow is like right underneath the pear, and so I can add that. Let that just blend in. Oh, there it happened right there. I let the two touch together. Again, though, it's so dark right there, it probably doesn't matter. But if I soak some of that up, nobody's ever going to know. That's it, guys. There's your pear. If you can paint that, you can paint with watercolor. Take a picture of it, put it on Classroom. Thanks.